Finance Leadership Alliance, the Global Center on Adaptation, and Adrienne Arsht-Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, thank you so much for joining this webinar focused on financing a climate resilient recovery in cities and beyond. Our aim today is to highlight that building resilience to climate impacts will be critical to the effectiveness of COVID response and recovery efforts. We also want to caution that climate adaptation finance flows are at risk of falling sharply in the coming years, and that at the moment when adaptation finance has never been more important. The pandemic, in fact, has exposed fragilities in the global economy and has highlighted our vulnerabilities to future risks, including climate change. It has deepened existing inequalities, and it has laid bare our ways in which our social and our economic fate is inextricably linked to that of nature. And so undoubtedly, mitigating climate change and increasing climate resilience will play an important role in securing a more inclusive, a more resilient, and a more sustainable future, while also reducing the global health burden. There have been unprecedented fiscal and monetary measures undertaken by governments since the last year to respond to the pandemic's impact. But going forward, it will be critical that economic recovery efforts undertaken by governments really kind of include an emphasis on resilience to climate-related risk to ensure that climate adaptation finance increases to meet the global needs. Not doing so would pose a significant threat to a sustainable recovery and to the world as we know it, given the looming climate crisis. With that urgent goal in mind, I'm very pleased to open today's event on financing a resilient recovery, and let me just offer a very brief preliminary preview of the next hour. We will first have two presentations on papers that have been released this year, highlighting the importance of adaptation finance and discussing critical challenges in scaling up financial flows. First, Nidhi Upadhyaya, the Associate Director at the Adrienne Arsht-Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, will present findings from a joint policy brief produced by the Adrienne Arsht-Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center and the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance on Urban Adaptation Finance Tracking. Then my colleague Morgan Richmond, who is a senior analyst at CPI, will present findings from the report Adaptation Finance in the context of COVID-19, which was jointly produced by the Global Center on Adaptation and Climate Policy Initiatives. Following those two presentations, we will move into a panel discussion, and we are very lucky to have as our moderator today Felipe Larraín, who is the Global Climate Finance Lead and Senior Advisor to the CEO at the Global Center on Adaptation and the former Finance Minister of Chile, and also the Professor of Economics at Universidad Católica de Chile and member of the UN Leadership Council for Sustainable Development. Following that introduction of our moderator, very pleased also to very briefly give you an overview of our panelists, who will be introduced in more detail at the beginning of our discussion. But we have today with us Nisha Krishan of the World Resources Institute, Joper Hagen of the Global Center on Adaptation, and Joshua Tanaka, who I'm very happy to see today again, who is now a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics. And finally, no one better than Kathy Bothman-McLeod, who is the Senior VP and Director of the Adrienne Arsht-Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council, to deliver closing remarks and wrap up this event. Please feel free to enter your questions into the chat window, which is available. We will aim to collect a few for the panel and also answer others in the chat. Again, we are excited to have all of you here with us today. We really want to make sure that we engage you in this discussion. But with that, welcome again, and let me pass the stage to Nidhi. Over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm pleased to share that the findings of our report today, the analysis of urban climate adaptation finance that I have co-authored with Morgan Richmond and Angela Pastor. Next slide, please. Our report aims to identify the barriers to financing resilient solutions in global urban areas and highlights entry points to drive action by stakeholders to increase urban adaptation finance. Next slide, please. But before I jump into the findings of the report, I would like to highlight the main objectives of this knowledge product. Our first objective was to estimate the overall size of primary financial flows to urban climate adaptation, both geographically and sectorally. Our next objective was to advance the methodology for tracking urban adaptation finance by proposing new data sources. Lastly, we've proposed recommendations for both improving tracking and increasing the volume and efficacy of urban adaptation finance flows based on the analysis of existing flows. Our data analysis for this report was informed by the Climate Policy Initiative's landscape, which is the base data set for this research, the World Bank's Private Participation in Infrastructure, or PPI database, and the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP Cities database. In the paper, we also highlight the coverage and challenges associated with each source. Next slide, please. To assess urban adaptation finance flows, this brief proposes a definition for urban adaptation activities and outlines how the definition of adaptation and urban are applied to these data sources. As these sources did not categorize the projects consistently as adaptation or resilience, this step helped us establish clear tags. Urban activities are those that address climate-related risks affecting a city and/or occur within city boundaries. This can then be divided further into full urban and partial urban. Full urban refers to activities where adaptation benefits would exclusively be for an urban area, for example, a city-based emergency response system. Partial urban, on the other hand, refers to activities where adaptation benefits are not exclusively urban. For example, a wastewater treatment plant serving both urban and suburban dwellers. The other key definition is that of adaptation finance and how it links to urban adaptation activities. These activities are the ones that target a climate risk affecting the city directly or that occur within the city boundary. For example, a reservoir outside city limits will still be an urban adaptation activity because it serves the city. Or the reinforcement of river basins occurring within the city boundary would also be an example of such an activity. But to fulfill the adaptation component, finance should represent resources directed to activities aiming to address climate-related risks faced by cities, contributing to urban resilience. Next slide, please. Let's take a look now at our top-line findings. Across sources tracked in our analysis, less than $4 billion were tracked in investments annually in 2017 and 18 for urban adaptation finance projects. In almost all regions, extreme heat and flooding or sea level rise were the most common hazards reported by city governments. Water and wastewater management projects addressing urban climate risk received the most finance of any sector, followed by disaster risk management. Next slide, please. In this graph here, you can see the estimated project costs that were reported by cities catering to different climate hazards. As I mentioned in the top line findings, we had less than $4 billion reported to urban adaptation finance in 2017 and 18, way lower than the reported costs of these projects you see here. Next slide, please. But why is it so challenging to finance projects? Urban adaptation projects face multiple public and private finance barriers. These include constraints on development finance institution mandates, limited municipal budget capacity, lack of creditworthiness, and poor policy as well as market environments that do not support adaptation investment. Next slide, please. But it's not all bad news. Despite these barriers, some cities have successfully implemented urban adaptation activities. The report highlights 12 such examples, along with details on financing sources and sample applications of financial instruments. Let me dive deeper into the San Francisco Resilience Bond here. In 2018, San Francisco voters approved a $425 million general obligation bond measure to begin fortifying a seawall along the Central Bayfront Road, the Embarcadero, in response to climate-related sea level and storm surge risks. Next slide, please. Finally, here is what we all can do to address these challenges and take action on adaptation finance gaps. Number one, This output could include a set of demonstrated case studies and a set of toolkits that a wide range of implementers and cities could engage with. Number 2, effective communication of tracking will show practitioners that others are also working on urban adaptation and create motivation and potential political will to generate buy-in. Number 3, because many adaptation activities involve public goods, the protection against the risk of transfer restrictions is key to attracting more private capital investment. Number 4, cities need support connecting technical experts, including those within government agencies, as well as academics or other thought leaders, with urban policy makers. Number 5, DFIs should involve cities in the development of country-assistance strategies in order to better consider urban perspectives and tailor products to meet the needs of the cities. And lastly, all efforts to increase finance to urban climate resilience should incorporate an understanding of the shifting set of risks facing urban dwellers because of the pandemic. I would now like to turn it over to Morgan Richmond, Senior Analyst at CPI, who will share the findings of the next report that we're discussing here today. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nidhi. Where the brief just discussed on urban adaptation finance tracking has a city-specific focus, this report broadens out to consider the impacts of COVID on global adaptation finance. On the next slide, we start with the understanding, as Barbara noted, that the COVID crisis is a wake-up call, that our social and financial systems need to be better prepared for the climate crisis. The report then outlines opportunities to identify and implement interventions that will support a resilient recovery to COVID. The report is divided into 3 sections: the state of play, where we assess adaptation finance flows leading up to 2020 and then beyond; the way forward, where we highlight tools that governments, development finance institutions, and the private sector have at their disposal to foster a resilient recovery; and then summary recommendations, where we identify major collaborative efforts that are needed to advance this work. Throughout, we capture findings from 5 country case studies: Chile, the Philippines, Kenya, Fiji, and Bangladesh. Given the time constraints, this presentation won't be comprehensive and won't capture findings from those case studies. So I encourage folks after this webinar to go and read the report in more detail, along with the brief on urban adaptation finance tracking. Nevertheless, I'll aim to offer a few of the key findings from each of the 3 sections. Next slide. So first, the state of play section summarizes the state of adaptation finance before 2020 and as affected by the pandemic. I'll highlight a few key takeaways here. So first, before the current crisis, $30 billion in adaptation finance flowed on average annually in 2017 and 2018, already far below the expected needs of up to $300 billion annually by 2030. This figure offers a breakdown of tracked adaptation finance by source, region, and sector. The key finding: no region or sector is receiving sufficient adaptation finance to respond to existing and approaching climate risks. Next slide. The pandemic has also exacerbated existing challenges to mobilizing adaptation finance while making countries more vulnerable to climate-related shocks and stressors. In particular, there's substantial risk that a growing funding gap and potential credit downgrades will starkly limit developing countries' capacity to finance climate resilience investments. Many climate-vulnerable countries are already facing high levels of debt distress, qualifying them for participation in G20's debt service suspension initiative. This figure here, which is figure 4 in the report, illustrates this theme. The axes are informed by ND gain analysis of vulnerability to climate risks on the x-axis and assessed readiness to effectively invest in adaptation action on the y-axis. And the color of the dots, each representing a country, indicates eligibility and participation status in the DSSI. The figure showcases that there's a high correlation between these DSSI eligible countries and those that are most climate vulnerable and least prepared to meet climate risks, the countries in the bottom right of the figure. To date, the DSSI has not been successful in freeing up sufficient funds for countries to meet COVID impacts or immediate adaptation needs. A final takeaway in the state of play that I'll note is that we estimate there is likely to be a single-digit percentage decline in public global adaptation finance flows in 2020, and potentially then a larger, though with high uncertainty, decline in the following years, taking into account a number of positive and negative outlook factors, including on the negative side of the ledger, increasing debt servicing costs, delays in project preparation and approvals given limited site capacity, for example, site visit capacity, for example, and slow vaccine rollout in climate vulnerable countries. While on the positive side of the ledger are a set of factors that offer some hope, including that adaptation finance had been increasing prior to 2020, and that there are accelerating global efforts to improve transparency and climate risk disclosure and to strengthen accounting frameworks for adaptation finance, as are both noted in the urban adaptation brief as well. Next slide. The way forward section then is structured to first outline the universe of adaptation interventions that are available, then second, to propose a prioritization framework for those interventions, and then third, to advance a process to identify context-appropriate financial instruments to finance those interventions. So first on this slide, to meet the dual COVID recovery and climate risk reduction goals, practitioners in the public and private sectors should start by understanding the universe of adaptation activities and how they can align with COVID recovery efforts. Taxonomies of adaptation activities broadly distinguish between asset-focused and systems-focused approaches to adaptation, and that's what we've done here, including both of those here, where asset-focused activities aim to maintain or enhance the resilience of an asset or activity to ensure its performance is fit for purpose over its design lifespan, and system-focused activities are designed with the primary objective of delivering adaptation benefits and resilience through an asset or activity for a larger system. This table is illustrative of a larger table in the report, which describes both sector-specific and cross-sectoral interventions. Next slide. We then advance a framework for prioritizing key interventions to achieve a resilient recovery, recognizing that because economic, social, and health impacts of the COVID crisis vary significantly within and across countries, that governments and DFIs should prioritize interventions based on context, as well as underlying climate vulnerability. That's what we've advanced here and in more detail in Table 5 in the report, which is adapted from World Bank's proposed sustainability checklist for assessing economic recovery interventions, which was published in April of last year. The considerations are divided into 3 categories to capture economic, climate, and health social outcomes. The climate considerations are demonstrative of emerging best practices among development finance institutions to ensure that investments are robust in responding to climate impacts. The economic and health social considerations represent critical elements of a resilient recovery, but not every intervention will or should fit all of these socioeconomic criteria. For instance, the economic considerations might be especially critical for countries experiencing a weak economic recovery scenario with a high debt burden and low capacity to access international markets. Next slide. Once adaptation interventions are prioritized, the report then describes financial instruments that can be utilized for recovery and resilience and outlines how components of a country's implementation context affect the kind of instruments that should be prioritized. We structured this analysis noting that selection of a financial instrument or set of instruments to implement adaptation interventions will depend on factors including required speed of implementation, private investment environment, sovereign debt, and monitoring and evaluation capacity. Connections between the 4 factors and the illustrative financial instruments are not intended to be prescriptive, but are instead meant to indicate the kinds of financial instruments best suited to various country contexts. I'll note that this slide is representative, or this table is representative of a table in the report, I believe table 6. And the next slide. Finally, the recommendation section captures the messages that run throughout the report to note there's a real risk of a low upside scenario where adaptation finance drops dramatically over the coming years, but there are many interventions that would help avoid this outcome, stimulating resilient recoveries. To determine which interventions would be most effective, countries should A, adopt a clear screening process for evaluating and prioritizing adaptation interventions, and then B, identify and select financial instruments that are most applicable to the economic and climate context in question. Major efforts in several areas will be required to keep a truly climate resilient recovery within reach, which will include increasing or at a minimum maintaining official development assistance levels, collaborating on debt relief for some of the most climate vulnerable countries, mainstreaming climate risk into liquidity support, vastly improving climate risk data for both public and private sectors, and adopting consistent and comparable metrics that capture adaptation and resilience benefits in addition to tracking flows. So I'll conclude here, and with the key findings of both the Urban Adaptation Finance Tracking brief and this report on adaptation finance in the context of COVID in mind, we'll pass the stage to Felipe Larraín, Global Climate Finance Lead and Senior Advisor to the CEO at the Global Center on Adaptation and former Finance Minister of Chile, Professor of Economics at Universidad Católica de Chile and member of the UN Leadership Council for Sustainable Development, to introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion. Felipe, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I would welcome everybody to this very interesting webinar and to the panel that we will have. Let me also thank Barbara, Nidhi, and Morgan for the introduction and two very interesting presentations of two reports that have highlighted very important aspects. One is the report on Urban Adaptation Finance Tracking. The other is the report on COVID-19 and adaptation finance in the context of this COVID pandemic. Let me say that we have first a superb panel, in front of us. But from these reports, we know that before I introduce the panelists, that building resilience to climate impacts has become more critical than ever to support the global aim to craft effective response and recovery efforts. We also know that climate adaptation finance flows are at risk of falling sharply in the coming years at a moment when adaptation finance has never been more important, more critical, and that cities in particular are facing cascading social, budgetary, and health risks associated with the COVID-19 pandemic alongside climate risks. Just to reflect on a few of the issues in terms of the financing needed. The Urban Adaptation Finance Tracking told us that less than $4 billion was tracked annually in 2017-18, and the adaptation finance in the context of COVID-19 told us that the current adaptation finance is completely insufficient regarding and in comparison to the needs. We are tracking in 2017-18 about $30 billion annually, and the needs are several times that amount. So, with the risk of falling further, the risk that this adaptation finance flows, falls, in the current scenario of COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 recovery. So, of course, we have issues that we have risks, but we have opportunity. With these findings of the two reports in mind, let me say what are the goals of this panel, which are mainly three. The first is to highlight key adaptation finance instruments deployed and outcomes to date from that deployment. The second is to discuss what we have learned, the lessons learned from instruments to date, and the opportunities for scale and replication for a resilient recovery. And the third is to advance the conversation on transformative interventions that could support implementation. Let me just give you a few examples. These interventions could include improving adaptation outcome metrics, building government capacity to implement adaptation activities, ensuring DFIs think strategically about urban settings, and prioritizing interventions that meet resilient recovery objectives. With these goals in mind for our panel, let me briefly introduce each of the panelists, and then I will turn to a more detailed introduction and questions to each of them. We're fortunate to have Nisha Krishnan, Senior Climate Finance Associate at the Climate Resilience Practice, World Resources Institute. We have with us also Joe Verhagen, who is a global lead on water at GCA. And we have also Joshua Tanaka, who is a visiting professor at LSE and formerly at EBRD. Let us go now in more detail to our first panelist, Nisha Krishnan. At the World Resources Institute, Nisha co-led the work of the Finance Action Track for the Global Commission on Adaptation, including work with the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment and the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, which I was, proudly a member of that coalition, and Chile led with Finland, have led for the last couple of years. Making the economic case for investment in resilience. She has made the economic case. She has helped develop national climate finance budget tracking methodologies and supports local governments and civil society organizations in conducting adaptation finance accountability assessments at the local level. Nisha has been leading work for an upcoming study where WRI has reviewed 2020 stimulus packages from 66 countries, including all G20 and V20 countries, the vulnerable 20 countries, to assess whether and how they included climate resilience. So in this scenario, Nisha, let me ask you a first question. From your assessment of countries' fiscal stimulus packages, what are the 2 or 3 most salient findings regarding inclusion of resilience components, and what themes emerged regarding approaches for climate risk? And let me add also, have you found whether countries are, which percentage of these countries do have adaptation finance, included in their recovery packages? Nisha, please.
Thanks, Felipe, and thanks for having me here today. So this review that we did over the last couple of months has really been to have a counterpoint to all of the studies out there that are tracking sort of the low carbon transition of these stimulus packages. And I would say that the Center and CPI's paper and this paper is probably the first one to really look at adaptation and resilience components of sort of the stimulus recovery conversation, as well as how finance is going to go looking forward. So to your last question, I think, we find that about 17 countries in the European Union explicitly have integrated some consideration of adaptation and resilience into their stimulus approaches, which is less than a third of our sample, right? So of the 66 countries. And furthermore, I would say that 12 of these countries, of the subset of 17, actually elevated climate risk and climate risk management as a core objective alongside their economic recovery pieces around job growth. And so you do have countries who are actually taking, are managing these climate risks at a very core level, the same way that they think about economic recovery. And these countries include countries like Bangladesh, Fiji, Kenya, some of the same countries that the paper Morgan mentioned are actually, that the case studies are there about. But I would also say that because we studied V20 countries, I would also point out that this is less than a quarter of the V20 country membership of 48 countries. So there is still a lot of room for improvement, even within the V20 membership, to take on the adaptation and resilience challenge. I would also say, because we looked at sort of the first tranche of stimulus responses, a lot of the measures that we saw were emergency responses, right? So whether that's related to food security and social safety nets, it's a lot of disaster sort of prevention and mitigation. So I would say that there is probably some more analysis that needs to be done, given that countries are still recovering, are still announcing stimulus packages. So this is something that we would like to repeat over the coming year to see whether there is more uptake, for example, of resilience and adaptation. Back to you, Felipe.
Well, thank you very much, Nisha. Let me turn to a second question and probably reflect on something. We have a lot of space to improve here, because only about a third of the countries are including these adaptation finance and adaptation and resilience in their recovery packages. So it means that you have over 60% of the countries that are not including them. So big space to move. On a second issue, what through lines did you observe in the approach to stimulus by countries that did integrate physical climate risk awareness and resilience components? And in particular, what can we say to countries in order for them to include these issues in their recovery packages? I'm pretty sure that, many of them are flooded with the immediate emergency issues, but what can we say to those countries to convince more of them to come into, incorporating these very important components?
Thanks, Felipe. That's a really great question, and something I think that we're still struggling with in some ways, right? One is that one interesting thing that we saw from the analysis is that the countries that chose to do adaptation and resilience through their stimulus were somewhat prepared, right? There are countries that are on the front line. So you think about Bangladesh, Nepal, Fiji, Kenya, the Philippines. They are all countries who have been experiencing climate impacts for the last 10, 20, 30 years and have budget processes, have climate risk screening management processes within their countries. And so I think this notion that Morgan and Nidhi also brought up, that capacity is very important, that preparedness in this case is much more important than we thought. And there's also this likelihood that they had investments in the pipeline that were already climate risk aware, that they were now able to use the stimulus sort of funds and recovery to actually finance those programs. So I think the notion that we do need more capacity, more tools and screening capabilities within governments, I think is something that has been strengthened through this experience, that we do need to, you have DFIs as well as bilateral governments and technical institutions working in this space, but there needs to be much more capacity within national governments, and I would argue to subnational governments, right, to cities as well, to take on these challenges. So I think that's one piece. I think the other piece that I would, in terms of making the case to countries, is that, you know, this is probably once in the next 20 to 30 year sort of investment point, right? The next 2 to 3 years as we recover from the pandemic, this is the time where you have large scale investments happening, that these are lock-in sort of effects, the same sort of arguments that I think we might use for the sustainability and the low carbon transition, but that we have sort of evidence showing that there is, you know, benefit cost ratios up to 10 to 1 that came out of the Global Commission's work, that show that we do have a lot of returns to investing in adaptation and resilience. And I think that's another piece that we can show. And these were, you know, for infrastructure investments, so whether that's energy, housing, water systems, or this is disaster risk management, those are all pieces that I think we can make the case to governments that the tools are out there, the financing is out there, because there is this whole other conversation where you have private investors and others who are saying that there isn't a pipeline. So there is, I think, opportunity here for countries to take on this challenge going forward.
Thank you very much, Krishna. I think, sorry, Nisha. I think these issues that you are telling us are very important, you know, that you have to build the local capacity, that you have to have at the local and the national level. It's not only just having at the national level. If you cannot do it, if we're talking about urban, if you cannot do it at the local level, then the benefit cost ratios, you know, are immense. So the returns on these projects are immense, and then we have huge opportunities. If you have the right projects and you have investments in the pipeline, you know, that are profitable from a social point of view, that you will get financing for those. So I think that's very important. Well, thank you very much, Nisha. That was very interesting. Let me now turn to Joep Verhagen, who is the global lead on water at the Global Center on Adaptation. Joep is building and leading large-scale water adaptation programs for the GCA in South Asia, Africa, and globally. He brings 25 years of international experience in the water sector. For the World Bank, he co-led the World Bank's support to the Clean India Mission, a combination of a $1.5 billion loan and a 25 million technical assistance program. Prior to joining the World Bank, Joep was part of the leadership team IRC International Water and Sanitation Center. Recently, Joep led a report released in January of this year on living with water, climate adaptation in the world's deltas, which aims through a series of case studies to answer the overarching question: what are the key bottlenecks and enablers to accelerate and scale water-related adaptation intervention in delta regions? So Joep brings a lot of expertise to us on this issue. Let me turn to a first question. Joep, what are the most significant barriers to financing adaptation in urban deltas that are unique to that context? So barriers that apply to those urban deltas in particular.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philippe, for your question, and thank you for having me here. If you look at deltas in the world, they are the climate hotspots because they are often the engines of economic growth, they're often the engines of human development, high population densities. At the same time, these are the areas which are hardest hit by climate change. One can think of sea level rise, for instance, in Bangladesh, is likely to lose 20% of its land surface if the sea level rises by 1 single meter. Um, so what you see, I think what adaptation and deltas need is one, we want we need a long-term strategy. And think, for instance, Bangladesh. They have a plan, the Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100. They need as well a long-term and predictable budget allocation. So the Netherlands has allocated $1.5 billion per annum for the coming 15 years. At the same time, what they need is a kind of flexibility and a capacity to adapt, to change course. These kind of frameworks are there in a few countries, but most countries don't have this framework that enable investment in deltas. The second part is that if you look at the water sector, building urban water resilience often requires investments outside the urban area in the upper part of the catchment. For instance, you can think about farmers planting trees instead of growing crops to increase water retention will then subsequently decrease urban droughts or urban floods. Now we often miss this mechanism to actually compensate these farmers, right? And the boundaries of the administrative boundaries do not coincide with the watershed boundaries. So that also kind of stops investment, for instance, in building resilience of water utilities. And the last one that I want to mention, it may be more generic than just deltas. It's not always availability of finance, what is the key limiting factors. What we see is that cities often miss the capacity to actually develop bankable projects that can be financed by financial institutions. And for that reason, GCA is setting up a Build Smart project preparation facility to actually invest in the upstream project preparation, strengthen enabling environments, help cities and countries to identify projects that actually help them to adapt to a changing climate and build urban resilience.
Well, thank you very much, Jerb. There is a common element here, building capacity, a common element to Nisha's theme also, in saying, well, what countries that were prepared, and included elements in their recovery packages, you're pointing to the same issue for the Delta. So that's a very important point, and the work that GCA is doing also in terms of helping countries and cities develop that capacity is extremely important. Let me turn to a second issue. Are there climate risks that exist in the Delta context that make certain kinds of financing more or less viable? So is there something unique in the deltas in terms of the types of financial packages?
So I think one thing, because what we perceive is that as building resilience in deltas really requires a strong role of the public sector. It's what we see is that though the economic engines, we see that the private sector might perceive the risk to be high to invest in the deltas. It really needs a strong public investment. And what private sector needs actually to invest in resilience in deltas is measures to guarantee or to reduce risks. So that's what we see. It's private finance, given that that might be hampered, given the strong and important role that the public sector has to play in building resilience in the deltas, long-term and large scale.
Well, that's interesting. Private sector, it's absolutely essential to bring in the private sector to invest here. So, I mean, reducing the risks, and I would also say that other than the project risk itself, if the institutional risks, are kept low and are reduced, that's a very important enticement for private sector investment here. So let me turn to a final question, Joy. What are some of the most critical steps implementers of development finance should be taking in the next several years that could yield co-benefits for climate resilience in urban deltas and COVID recovery?
So I think it's been mentioned already, and I'm not sure what it's specific to deltas, but safe water and safe hand washing facilities is something that 3.5 billion people do not have access to. So 3.5 billion people around the globe do not have access to safe and adequate hand washing facilities, and that actually comes also with a adequate water supply. So if we want to create co-benefits, investing in a resilient water supply that gives adequate, reliable, and access to safe water will be the key to actually create this co-benefits. What needs to be fought, what the adaptation sector really kind of needs to struggles with, is what is mainstream, normal, the investments in, for instance, in water utility, reducing non-revenue water, and what is specific to climate adaptation, and actually kind of make sure that utilities become more resilient against climate risk. And I think again, it's the water security, ensuring that there are no more Cape Town Day Zero events. And it's not just Cape Town; they're happening in Chennai in India. Day Zero is very close for many cities. And I think actually investing in that, making sure that Day Zero doesn't happen across the world in many cities, would be the key investment that the sector can make to A, ensure climate resilience, B, also make sure that we create benefits for COVID, like we create co-benefits actually dealing with COVID-19, but also future pandemics. Hygiene is key. And it also, I think, safe water supply, what we see from the data, actually also stimulates economic growth and human development.
Well, 3.5 billion people, less than half, but slightly less than half of the world population lack access to safe water and hand washing facilities. That's something that should be driving us to invest more on that capacity. Thank you very much, Joab. Let me now turn to our final panelist, Josué Tanaka, who is a visiting professor in practice at LSE and former managing director of operational strategy and planning, energy efficiency and climate change at EBRD. Josué was the founding leader of the EBRD EBRD Climate Finance Initiative, launched in 2006, covering investment, policy development, capacity building, and technical assistance across the EBRD countries of operations. He was the managing director responsible for climate action and operational strategy and planning at the EBRD until January 2021. Josué has worked on development and environmental matters for close to 40 years, starting in Brazil and the World Bank before joining the EBRD at its inception in 1991. At EBRD, Josué conceived the EBRD's Green Cities program, which has almost 2 billion euros in funding for cities with populations above 100,000 in the EBRD region, and is focused in part on supporting adaptation of cities to climate impacts. Very welcome, Josué. What do you see as a first question? What do you see as the key challenges cities face in mobilizing finance for adaptation? And what aspects of those challenges have been exacerbated by COVID impacts?
Well, thank you very much, Felipe, and also let me also acknowledge very much the role you played in the formation of the Coalition of Finance Ministers on climate action, and I will get back to that reference in our discussion. Look, I think I've heard the colleagues put a lot of emphasis on the adaptation side, and so I'm going to, if it's okay with you, put quite an emphasis more on the finance side, and particularly to try to outline to this webinar, what I think is a very severe impact of the pandemic on the financial situation of cities. And really cities have been hit, I would say, from two sides, right? On one side, they've been hit, if you want, by, let's say, the revenue side, so less revenues. And on the other side, they've been hit by, increasing expenditures. Let me, because I'm a person who deals a lot with numbers, so let me give you a few examples because I think they will illustrate the scale of the challenge. If you take some European examples, you take Barcelona, for example, minus 14% estimate in decrease of GDP of Barcelona. That's 4 times the magnitude of the hit in 2009 financial crisis. You look at Germany, rich country, minus almost 16 billion euros less in municipal tax estimated just from the beginning of the pandemic. You look at a country like Bulgaria, minus 41% own revenue source decrease from municipalities, affecting 95% of the municipalities in Bulgaria. On top of it, you also have things like losses of fees, for public services. Just to give you, there was a survey from the Council of European Municipalities, minus 64% decrease in fee income for kindergartens, minus 56% for marketplaces. I could go on and on, but I'll stop here because it gives you already an order of magnitude of the negative hit. The other side of this, as I mentioned, has been the increase in expenditure. Things like we, in many cases would not have imagined 2 years ago. Provision of meals, homeless reception centers, the deficit of public transport that needs to be, compensated. So you have essentially this double effect, of reduced revenues and increased expenditures. On top of it, when we look at it, the financial assistance from central government, at least to date, and that relates to some of the comments that have been made by colleagues before, the rescue packages have provided some fund to offset that, but not the same amount. So there is still, if you want, a negative balance in that. And finally, since we're talking about investment here in adaptation, the question becomes, what is the impact of this financial situation caused by the pandemic on the ability to invest, right? And that's the core of the question that we're discussing here. Because again, to summarize, if you look at the financial condition of cities, they've been hit on the tax, revenue possibilities. There's been sharp pressure on intergovernmental transfers and, hits on public services. So I think it's very important in the discussion that we're having today, and that's a theme in a way, maybe I'll close the answer to your first question in that way, that we must not look at adaptation alone, right? Because in a way, cities, mayors, governments are confronting a range of issues. And so the key question really becomes one of prioritization, right? And that would be, I would say a key element I would put here, which is, yes, all the points that have been made, about the importance of adaptation, absolutely correct. But, for example, as a result of the pandemic, you've had a big increase in social issues. How do you balance that? The short-term requirements on social versus adaptation. So perhaps, Philippe, I'll stop here for now, not to be too long, but this was just a bit, I hope not too dark, but at least a view on, I would say, the realities of the finance situation.
Well, thank you very much, Josué. I certainly, the financial aspects is very dear to the heart of people who have worked in finance, or finance ministers, and those who are specialized on these fiscal issues. This is a local fiscal issue, but a very important one. I would say that 2 additional points here, that the recovery in 2021 will improve the finances of local finances. Because tax revenues will increase with the recovery, but that even if they will be facing smaller deficits, the local public finance will be weakened by the COVID. So that's something that will, stay in time. Let me just say also, turn to my second question here. What one or two actions would you most want to see from DFIs and from national level policymakers to increase access to adaptation finance for cities?
Well, I think first of all, let's look at the reality where we're coming from, right? And I think the reports that have been produced just ahead of this webinar show, for example, that there's been a huge share of adaptation finance that has come from DFIs, right? And if I remember the number correctly, I think it's somewhere around 79%. So let's say 80%, has been coming from DFIs, with very little from the private sector, right? I think the number that I seem to remember is something like 2%. So, that's where we're coming from. And so we are not even discussing yet what the impact, your first question, Felipe, on, the impact of the pandemic, but even pre-pandemic, you already had a picture that was very skewed, to public sector, finance for adaptation. In terms of the DFIs themselves, I think, and, as you kindly mentioned in your, in my introduction, I did work for DFIs for almost 40 years. I think a key element here is the commitment to increase, the finance in adaptation. So if you look at the World Bank, I think they've mentioned a 50% target. If you look, for example, at the joint statement that the multilateral development banks made at the UN Climate Action Summit, they also essentially committed to to double, adaptation finance to 2025. So that, I think, is the key element, is this element of commitment. And, there is the famous one, right? That what doesn't get measured, people don't act on. And, to a certain, by setting these targets, I think that, you will have, and you will see, and you're seeing already, increased DFI involvement in adaptation. I think also very important to mention, and that moves to national governments. So I would put perhaps three elements there on national governments. First, in developed countries, the importance, and I would say rising importance, of concessional finance for adaptation, right? Because we all know one of the big issues, on adaptation is often that the revenue, flow, even if we can compute very significant economic benefits over time, very often the financial calculation, particularly the assignment of revenue flows, is much more difficult. On top of it, that many of the requirements are in developing countries, which require also, I would say, blending finance instruments, to be worked on. So that's the first element, mostly to developed countries. At national level, I think one question was mentioned already by Nisha a few minutes ago, which is really this famous, and you, Felipe, asked the question, how do you inspire, or how do you convince, governments to put adaptation as part of their recovery? That has to be there. If it's not there, it's not going to happen. And the third one, perhaps I close with that, Felipe, going back to the coalition of finance ministers, is perhaps also some thinking about the development of what I would call multi-level finance. In other words, how can cities have higher finance capacity so that they can take, among other investments, adaptation investment? So this would be my answers to your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua. Very interesting. Many points here. We have little time. I would like to dwell a bit more on the institutional aspects of, municipal or local finance. I mean, in some countries, local governments, in order to get, tap resources in the market, they need approval. They cannot do it on their own. They need approval from the central government. Other countries, can move more freely. Those are part of the issues in getting more the private sector involved, but we don't have time for that. Let me, in 1 minute, turn to a final question and then move to, if we can, to a question from the public. How has the COVID crisis changed your approach to what effective adaptation finance looks like, and what sectors or systemic supports are needed? In 1 minute.
Look, in 1 minute. First, I would say what the current situation has raised for me is really this perception of the increased gap between a rising awareness of the importance of resilience versus a decreased capacity on city finance. So that is the key challenge, if you want, I think, that we have in front of us. Resilience clearly has become much better understood and a much higher priority just at the time when financial capacity is decreased. Therefore, the one word I would put here is really the word I put about prioritization, right? And about essentially being able to build the argumentation of the economic and financial and environmental contribution of adaptation investment so that it can be perceived, and by the way, even by the cities themselves, that they would put that as a top level area for investment. So that would be really my key answer to your question.
Well, thank you very much, Josué. We have had a very interesting panel. Let me turn now to Morgan Richmond, to see whether we have a question from the public, from the audience, that could be done in, briefly now, because we are approaching the end of our panel.
Sure. Thanks to all the panelists. And I'll ask a question combining two from the audience. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions. Acknowledging that this is a question that requires much more than the 2-minute answer that someone will provide. Because it's often very challenging to capture the true social benefits of adaptation or provide a return to an investor, what are your thoughts on opportunities to draw in private finance and make critical projects bankable for both the private sector and for public finance? Again, I'll not acknowledge that that's a hard question to answer in just a few minutes, but if just one or two of you wants to take a stab at it, that would be great. And then we'll pass to Kathy Boffman-McLeod from the Adrienne Arsht-Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center to close the event. But over to a panelist.
Yeah, I can answer very quick, and then I'm sure Nisha and Job will have. Look, the key approach we've had to date, I would say one observation and one recommendation. The observation is that I always consider that private sector financing of adaptation is the holy grail of climate finance. It's difficult. Now, the way you can do it is essentially to build adaptation, to mainstream, in a way, adaptation into the assessment of private investment. And that is the first way that you actually focus and channel private money into it. Maybe I'll stop here so that other colleagues can answer too.
Yeah, I think I would like to add to that, and that's a slightly different angle on private finance. A city often is owned by private people, right? Houses, factories. And for instance, to increase the permeability of city surfaces, to absorb more rainwater, and to reduce urban flash floods, you need to take along the private sector in a slightly different part of the private sector as well. People and companies who own private property in a city. Building regulations is key, recognizing also, of course, that regulations are sometimes hard to enforce. It's an add-on, it's not a replacement to what the previous speaker said. Thank you.
Just to finally add, I think both Josué and you got it right in the sense that at the end of the day, any investment that you make, whether that's private or public, should include resilience, right? Without that, your investment is actually not going to last as long as you think it is. You're going to have additional damages. You're going to have things that your maintenance goes up over time. And so there is a case to be made that upfront costs are offset by longer term reductions in maintenance and destruction costs. And so that is both for public and private. And that's the same way that we would think about sort of passing off risks to the insurance firms. There's only so much risk you can pass off without it becoming an implicit liability on both governments and private actors. So I think there is a huge case to be made in terms of avoided costs, as well as sort of the spillover effects that you might have into social and environmental benefits. So hopefully that is a pretty comprehensive question, answer from all three of us on what we can do to go forward further. So, thanks.
Well, to close this panel, let me thank for very interesting thoughts and participation to Nisha, Joep, and Joshua. And, many themes were, we could touch on many issues, but many themes we couldn't deliver, very more specifically or more in depth because of time constraints. So maybe there will be another opportunity. To close the event, let me pass on the floor to Kathy Bachman-McLeod of the Adrienne Arsht-Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center to offer our final thoughts on the key themes discussed in the two presentations and the panel. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you for wonderful moderation. And thank you to the partnership that we have with CCFLA and CPI and Barbara and her team. It's just been phenomenal. I'm Kathy Bachman-McLeod, and I'm the director of the Adrienne Arsht-Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council. We are focused on bringing resilient solutions to 1 billion people by 2030 to the challenges of climate impacts, migration, and human security. And one of the key focal areas for us is cities and thinking about cities finance. And so when we think about this paper, the opportunity to channel risk financing by understanding what the flows are and what the tools are that cities need to understand how we define it, but the ultimate goal is to grow it. And some of the things that we know, the UN's projection of 3 billion people living in slums and settlements by 2050, with 1 billion people in slums today, and the creditworthiness and the debt that countries are in up to their eyeballs. There are a lot of challenges, and Josue highlighted them very clearly, and frankly, there are a lot of challenges, but the paper and this discussion today provide our baseline. They get us focused on how we define it, what it is, and how we move forward. And at our center, the Resilience Center, we think a lot about the chain of understanding what these climate risks are and assessing what can reduce those risks and what access to capital we have to reduce those risks and the cost of capital and those challenges that are immense. And then you have risk left over that you need to transfer, and how does that get done? And so in that chain of thinking about climate risk management, that's on the risk side, but then there's so much opportunity. We have to mention nature-based solutions as one of those big opportunities. The other is, I'll quickly mention that we are developing in partnership with the Climate Risks and Extreme Weather Group at ETH in Zurich and our partner David Bresch, a transformed economics of climate adaptation cost-benefit analysis tool that allows from a desktop, pretty easy user-friendly tool that lets you assess the interventions that are reducing climate risks in cities and assess their cost effectiveness. And we have transformed the original ECA tool to include gender, biodiversity, and social vulnerability, so that we can now look at a cost curve that tells us, with the considerations of the community, those factors. And we'll be looking at a beta test of that version of that tool in the next couple of months, April or May. And then I wanted to say that we are providing this session will be is recorded and going to be available, and the papers. You can find them at our website, 1billionresilient.org. Any of the questions that you have about today's session, please tweet us at Arsht-Rock, and we'll get you all the detail you need. And then I want to say an extra thanks to the organizers today, and to Nidhi and Morgan for the hard work on this paper. And I want to underscore the fundamental importance of it as we track forward. And it's gritty and it's tough, but this is where when we come together, we can bring more attention to this and bring more finance. And Josue, I love the focus on the finance. The resilience pieces are really important, but the finance is everything. And so I'll close with that and say again, thank you to all of the participants, to the organizers, to the authors, and especially to the audience for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.